April 1945. A thin layer of morning frost clings to the canvas walls of a temporary American transit camp on the outskirts of Eisenach. The war is collapsing, and in the gray half-light, hundreds of surrendered Germans stand in quiet lines, exhausted soldiers, scattered civilians, and a small group of young women who had followed frontline units as auxiliaries and entertainers. Their boots sink slightly into the cold mud. Their breaths form pale clouds in the air. These women stand tightly clustered, coats wrapped around them, eyes lowered. For days they have heard stories, whispers traded in barns, cellars, and crowded roads, that the Americans strip prisoners during registration, force them through humiliating inspections, and treat them with the same brutality they had been warned about since 1939. Fear settles over them like a second winter. At the front of the line, a military policeman lifts a clipboard and calls for the next group. The women flinch. One glances at the others and begins to unbutton her coat, expecting the worst, preparing for humiliation she believes is inevitable. But the guard freezes, confused, then raises a hand sharply. What happens next will shatter everything these women thought. The women who now stood in American custody came from a wide and often misunderstood spectrum of wartime roles. They were not enlisted Wehrmacht troops, nor were they combat personnel. Most belonged to the informal, shifting world of Trossfrauen, camp followers, voluntary auxiliaries, laundresses, clerks, cooks, and women who provided entertainment or companionship to frontline German units. Some had traveled with divisional bands or mobile theater groups. Others had attached themselves to supply convoys or medical detachments, earning food and protection in the chaos of retreat. They were civilians living in the shadow of the front, folded into the German war machine without possessing uniforms, ranks, or any formal status. By late 1944 and early 1945, these women were increasingly swept up in the collapse of the Reich. As American armored divisions pushed through the Ruhr, the Rhineland, and into central Germany, entire German formations dissolved. Roads filled with retreating soldiers, wounded men, displaced civilians, and scattered auxiliaries, an entire society in motion. When officers surrendered, everyone behind them was taken with them, including these women. Many had no say in the matter, capture came as silently as the front line shifting past them. American POW columns, designed to handle tens of thousands of prisoners in a single day, made no initial distinction between soldiers, Volkssturm conscripts, and women attached to frontline units. At collection points, MPs directed everyone into holding areas before sorting began. It was an overwhelming logistical challenge: names recorded, categories assigned, valuables registered, weapons removed, and prisoners marched toward railheads or truck convoys bound for temporary camps. For German men, the process was understood. For German women, it was terrifying. They had never imagined themselves standing behind barbed wire or being processed like prisoners of war. Their fears were fueled by months of propaganda that had painted American soldiers as ruthless and immoral. Pamphlets warned that Allied troops humiliated captives, stripped them, shaved them, photographed them, and subjected them to degrading medical checks. These stories were repeated in cellars during air raids, whispered along refugee routes, and reinforced by officers determined to keep morale intact. So when American guards called their group forward at Eisenach, many women assumed their worst expectations were about to come true. They did not understand how U.S. camps functioned, nor the procedures the guards themselves were obligated to follow. What they feared was an imagined enemy, one constructed by their own government. To understand why this moment of misunderstanding became so striking, we must look more closely at the systems, rules, and contrasting cultures that shaped these encounters. The American system these women were entering was far more structured, and far more constrained, than they realized. By 1945, U.S. forces were operating under strict administrative protocols shaped by the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States had ratified and applied consistently across Europe. Every prisoner, regardless of rank, gender, or nationality, was entitled to humane treatment, adequate shelter, food, and protection from public curiosity or degrading punishment. For American MPs and processing officers, these rules were not abstract guidelines, they were daily operational requirements, reinforced by commanders who understood both the moral weight and the political consequences of mistreating POWs. This created a sharp cultural contrast. German propaganda had insisted for years that surrender meant dishonor, humiliation, and abuse. But the American military environment these women encountered was rooted in procedure, paperwork, and discipline. Registration lines were designed for efficiency: a tag number, a basic medical check, delousing as needed, and assignment to a holding area. There was no policy, no directive, and no accepted practice that allowed or required female captives to be stripped in front of male personnel. If clothing had to be inspected or exchanged, female medical staff or Red Cross workers were brought in wherever possible. However, the speed of the Allied advance meant that many temporary camps were not equipped with dedicated female personnel on the first day of operation. This gap, between American regulation and field reality, fueled misunderstanding. German women, already primed by months of fear, saw the hurried motions of American MPs as confirmation of their worst expectations. A guard pointing to a tent could be misread as a threat, a medic requesting a lice check could be interpreted as a demand for public stripping. Language barriers only deepened the anxiety. In many cases, rumors spread faster than instructions. A single misinterpreted command could echo through an entire group. One woman's fear became the next woman's certainty, until whole clusters of captives braced themselves for humiliation that was never intended. These psychological spirals were common in the final weeks of the war, when exhausted civilians and retreating auxiliaries were thrust into unfamiliar systems run by an enemy whose behavior they did not yet understand. American officers, for their part, were often puzzled by the visible panic among female captives during registration. They had expected resistance or defiance from German soldiers, but they had not anticipated this kind of quiet dread. It took time, and repeated encounters, for guards to realize that these women were reacting not to anything the Americans were doing, but to what they had been told: human fear. For the German women standing in those registration lines, fear was not a momentary emotion, it was the culmination of years of conditioning. In their world, surrender carried a sense of cultural shame deeper than defeat itself. They had been raised in a society where honor was tied to appearance, modesty, and control. Now they found themselves behind barbed wire, surrounded by foreign soldiers, stripped of certainty and social protections. The idea of victor's revenge, whispered along the retreating roads, played endlessly in their minds. Many believed that being forced to undress was not a possibility but an inevitability, part punishment, part demonstration of power. Their trembling hands, downcast eyes, and stiff posture spoke a language older than the war: the fear of humiliation, the dread of being exposed before strangers, and the belief that defeat would erase their dignity. This internal panic shaped how every command was heard, every gesture interpreted. American Guards duty. The young American MPs tasked with processing German captives carried a very different set of burdens. Most were barely older than the prisoners they guarded, men who had been thrust into roles requiring authority, discipline, and emotional steadiness. They were trained to follow the Geneva Convention not just as policy but as a standard of military professionalism. To them, the registration line was a logistical challenge, not a moral battleground: names recorded, illnesses checked, weapons confiscated, and order maintained. Their interactions with prisoners were meant to be brisk, procedural, and consistent. Yet they quickly noticed the tension among the German women: flinches at raised voices, panic at simple gestures, trembling during instructions. The MPs were often confused more than anything else, unaware that their efficient, clipped commands were being filtered through layers of fear and propaganda. Their duty was clear, but understanding the prisoners' reactions required patience they had not been trained for. Technological/procedural angle. The misunderstanding that sparked the dramatic moment in the registration tent stemmed largely from the delousing protocol, a standard Allied procedure designed to stop disease, not dignity. Mobile delousing units used chemical sprays, powder applicators, and heated tents to kill lice, fleas, and other parasites common among retreating populations. For male prisoners, removing outer layers of clothing for inspection was routine, efficient, and unremarkable. But for women, especially those from conservative rural backgrounds, the word delousing suggested nakedness, exposure, and shame. When American medics gestured toward the sanitation area, many German women assumed the worst. They did not understand that female prisoners were usually separated for privacy or given alternative checks when female staff were unavailable. The technical language of procedure, inspection, cleaning, processing, sounded harsh when filtered through their fear. Thus, a simple logistical measure became a symbol of imagined humiliation, igniting a panic rooted more in misunderstanding than reality. Enemy psychology. Surrender reshapes identity in an instant. For these German women, the moment they stepped behind American lines, everything they believed about themselves shifted. They were no longer auxiliary supporters of a powerful army, they were captives dependent on the mercy of the enemy they had been taught to fear. The shift in power dynamics was absolute. Even the simplest interaction, an MP waving them forward, a medic checking a name tag, felt charged with imbalance. In their minds, the Americans held not only physical power but moral authority, the right to define their fate. This psychological collapse often intensified small misunderstandings, turning a neutral command into a perceived threat. Many women tried to make themselves invisible, hoping to avoid drawing attention, while others attempted to appear compliant to prevent retaliation. Their identities as German women had been transformed overnight into something far more vulnerable, powerless individuals waiting to see how the enemy would define them. Moral/cultural clashes. The encounter between German female captives and American guards revealed a profound clash of wartime cultures. Nazi propaganda had worked tirelessly to portray Allied soldiers as ruthless violators who would degrade German women at the first opportunity. This messaging was not fringe rhetoric, it was repeated in schools, radio broadcasts, and party meetings. But the American military ethos operated on a different foundation: discipline, procedural fairness, and adherence to international law. To American MPs, protecting the dignity of prisoners was a requirement, not a courtesy. The German women, however, interpreted every movement through the lens of propaganda. A hand signal became a threat, a shouted instruction a warning of abuse. This gulf in expectations led to confusion on both sides. The Americans saw frightened faces where they expected defiance, the Germans saw danger where there was none. The resulting tension was not just logistical, it was cultural, moral, and deeply rooted in wartime narratives. Leadership decisions. Behind the frontline chaos stood officers who shaped how POWs were treated. American commanders understood that the volume of captives in 1945, the moment had been building for hours. The German women, pushed forward through the muddy clearing toward the registration tent, moved with the rigid, fearful slowness of people awaiting punishment. Their coats were clutched tightly around them, knuckles whitening at every sharp command from the American MPs. When the guards motioned toward the sanitation area, standard procedure for all incoming prisoners, the women froze. A few exchanged desperate glances. One began unbuttoning her coat, another pulled her collar closed, trembling. To them, this was the moment they had dreaded since the surrender. This was where humiliation would begin. The American MPs, exhausted from days of non-stop processing, misread their hesitation as simple non-compliance. They repeated their gestures, more firmly this time, pointing toward the delousing station. The women recoiled. A murmur of panic rippled through the group. One woman's voice cracked as she asked, in broken English, "Do we take clothes off?" The guards stared back, puzzled. They had seen fear in German soldiers, even defiance. But this trembling, silent dread, was something else. A few men stepped closer, hands raised in what they assumed was a calming gesture, though the sudden movement only deepened the panic. The misunderstanding swelled like a storm about to break. Then the senior MP officer arrived. He had been overseeing the record tables when he noticed the commotion. Stepping forward, he surveyed the group, women shrinking away, clutching their coats, bracing for a humiliation he could not yet understand. Switching to slow, clear English, he addressed the nearest cluster. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "No clothes off. You keep your clothes on." The women stared at him, unable to process the words. He repeated them, louder this time, tapping his own jacket for emphasis. "We won't take our clothes off. No undressing here." The effect was immediate. The nearest woman blinked rapidly, another pressed a hand to her mouth. Disbelief, confusion, and relief mixed across their faces. Some lowered their heads, not in shame but in a release of tension so sudden it left them unsteady. The officer signaled to the medics and clarified the procedure. The women were to pass through a basic visual check, no stripping required. Only in cases of visible infestation would further inspection occur, and even then, female personnel were preferred whenever available. The delousing powder could be applied over clothing, and any additional steps would be done privately, never in front of male guards. This was U.S. Army doctrine in 1945, shaped by the Geneva Convention, practical field considerations, and an institutional emphasis on preserving the dignity of prisoners, especially women. But to German captives conditioned by years of fear, this simple clarification was astonishing. In that moment, the tension in the tent shifted. Panic loosened its grip. The women continued forward, still uncertain, but now aware that what awaited them was procedure, not punishment. And as this realization spread quietly through the line, the turning point of the encounter began to take shape. Relief did not arrive all at once. It spread slowly, cautiously, moving from woman to woman like a warmth thawing the frozen air around them. The first few captives proceeded through the line hesitantly, watching every gesture of the American medics, bracing for a last-minute reversal. But when each emerged from the tent fully clothed, carrying only a faint dusting of delousing powder on their sleeves, the tension finally began to unravel. A murmur of astonished whispers drifted through the group. "They did nothing. They didn't touch us. They let us keep everything on." For many, this was the first direct contradiction to years of propaganda. Their shoulders loosened. Hands unclenched. Some women swallowed back tears they had suppressed since their capture. Others glanced at the Americans with expressions no longer shaped solely by fear, but by curiosity, trying to reconcile the enemy they had imagined with the one standing before them. Sensing the change, the senior MP officer issued new instructions. A separate tent, originally intended for medical storage, was quickly cleared and designated for female processing. Whenever possible, Army nurses or Red Cross women would supervise the area, ensuring privacy and minimizing misunderstandings. Male guards remained outside the entrance, maintaining order but giving space. Inside, the procedures were conducted with measured calm. Identification tags recorded, basic health checks performed, lice powder applied sparingly. For women with visible exhaustion or illness, medics offered water, blankets, or a place to sit. These small gestures, mundane by American standards, felt extraordinary to prisoners who had expected degradation. One woman stared at the blanket handed to her as if it were a trick. Another asked twice. Once the initial panic subsided, the women were processed with the same methodical efficiency applied to all prisoners, but with added consideration for their gender and vulnerability. Identification tags were issued, personal belongings inventoried, and medical checks performed by available female staff were supervised carefully to maintain privacy. Meals followed strict Army rationing procedures: bread, canned meat, powdered milk, and occasionally vegetables when supply lines allowed. Though sparse by civilian standards, the consistent provision of food, water, and shelter marked a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured during retreat. Housing arrangements reflected both practicality and regulation. Women were assigned to separate barracks or tents, often in clusters to provide mutual support, with guards posted at entrances rather than within the living spaces themselves. Army records from the European Theater of Operations emphasized the importance of gender segregation, noting that female captives required specific attention to preserve dignity while maintaining security. Reports describe that officers frequently inspected facilities, ensuring cleanliness, warmth, and adherence to minimal comfort standards mandated under Geneva Convention protocols. Relationships between guards and captives evolved quickly, shaped by repeated interactions. Initially wary and tense, the women began to recognize the procedural consistency of American authority. MPs, following orders and guided by training, treated the captives with calm professionalism. Over time, brief exchanges, requests for assistance, clarifications about schedules, or directions to latrines, softened the edges of fear. Guards reported that women who had been visibly panicked on the first day moved with cautious confidence by the end of the week. While trust was far from complete, these early encounters established a foundation for order, minimizing incidents of resistance, misunderstanding, or panic. The efficiency of processing, coupled with humane treatment, drew subtle attention within camp reports. One administrative note from March 1945 remarked on the surprising adaptability of the female POWs once procedural clarity is provided, highlighting that the earlier crisis was largely a result of miscommunication rather than defiance or misconduct. The combination of structured housing, consistent feeding schedules, and disciplined but respectful oversight created a controlled environment where fear could slowly give way to security. These practices, though ordinary within U.S. military policy, contrasted sharply with the expectations German captives had carried into the camp. For many, this period became the first sustained exposure to an Allied approach that adhered to law, discipline, and practical morality. It was here that the subtle psychological shift began, an awareness that captivity did not inherently equal humiliation. And this awareness would carry into the next chapter, the eventual repatriation and reflection on what had been experienced. By late 1945 and into 1946, the process of repatriation began in earnest. German women, along with thousands of other prisoners, were transported back to Germany in organized convoys, often by rail under military escort. Records from the U.S. Army Transportation Corps indicate that special attention was given to hygiene, health, and orderly boarding procedures. Women who had initially feared humiliation found themselves treated with the same structured care they had come to experience in camp, assigned seats, meal provisions during transit, and minimal exposure to male soldiers during travel. Contemporary reports, diaries, and post-war interviews provide insight into the captives' reactions. Many women expressed astonishment at the consistency and decency of American procedures. One former auxiliary noted in a 1946 diary, "I expected cruelty, but they treated us like people, not animals." Another recalled her disbelief at the simple courtesy of being allowed to keep her coat and personal items. Such accounts highlight how the early misunderstanding in processing had given way to a lasting recognition: the enemy could act with fairness, even in victory. The repatriation experience also reflected broader trends in Allied POW handling. Across the European theater, standardized procedures, adherence to Geneva regulations, and the presence of female medical staff for women prisoners became the norm. Reports compiled by the War Department emphasized that humane treatment not only fulfilled legal obligations but also reduced tension, prevented uprisings, and reinforced orderly administration. The Eisenach experience exemplified these policies in practice, showing how small procedural decisions, such as the senior MP's clarification about clothing, could have outsized effects on morale and perception. For the women themselves, the experience reshaped their understanding of captivity, enemy conduct, and the complexities of wartime morality. Fear, once the constant companion of surrender, had been replaced by cautious observation. In the quiet moments at Eisenach, the tension, fear, and uncertainty of war condensed into a single human experience. The German women, conditioned by years of propaganda and the relentless fear of enemy retribution, faced what they believed would be inevitable humiliation. And yet, what unfolded was not cruelty, but procedural clarity and discipline, a reminder that war does not always have to strip away humanity. Their fear, deeply rooted in assumptions and cultural narratives, illustrates how the mind can carry the weight of imagined horrors longer than armies can enforce them. Assumptions about the enemy's intentions often linger, resistant to evidence, even as the physical realities of battle and surrender shift around them. At Eisenach, fear met rules, and myths collided with orderly action. The simple assertion that, "we won't take our clothes off," became a turning point, dissolving panic and preserving dignity, proving that structure, law, and ethical conduct can reshape human perception in profound ways. This episode reflects a broader truth of warfare, that the ethical choices of individuals, guided by law, morality, and professionalism, can temper the chaos around them. Even in defeat, even amid total collapse, humans retain the capacity to act with decency. And while regimes rise and fall, propaganda fades and myths are challenged, the lived experiences of courage, restraint, and humane conduct endure. Eisenach reminds us that the slow erosion of assumptions can be as decisive as military campaigns, and that in the shadow of war, humanity persists, not as a